Hi everyone, welcome to the Ecological Continuity Trust webinar series. Some quick housekeeping. Please can I ask you to stay muted until question and answers, if you can unmute if Ben asks you to ask questions. Can I also ask you to turn off your videos if you have it on, just to save on bandwidth. If you think of questions as we're going through the seminar, please feel free to pop them in the chat, or you can put them in the chat at the end, and Ben will highlight them for everyone. Very pleased to welcome today Gareth Clay from the University of Manchester. Gareth's going to be talking to us about linking up long-term experiments with wildfire research. Over to you, Gareth.
Okay, thank you very much, Carly. I'll just wait to get the control. Brilliant. Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you very much, Ben and Carly, for the invite today to speak to the Ecological Continuity Trust and the lunchtime webinar series. It's really good to see you all and amongst lots of great ecological experts. So as the non-ecologist in the room, I do hope I do this talk some justice. So I hope by the end of the half an hour or so, you'll get at some sense of some of the key research questions that I think the wildfire community and the ecological community could perhaps look at, and to explore some of those challenges, some of those opportunities, and how we might overcome some of those challenges to do that linking up for the long term with wildfires. So it's going to be a little bit of a whistle-stop tour around wildfire research, and I think I'm going to end up proposing more questions than I actually answer, but I do hope this stimulates some discussion for our question and answer at the end of the presentation. So I do very much look forward to the questions later on. Okay, so before I kind of talk through some of the elements of wildfire research in the UK, how we might link to that wildfire long-term monitoring, I just kind of want to take a step back and think about fire more generally, and perhaps some of the more philosophical questions around fire and its research. So fire, this is a kind of a tagline or a kind of an introduction slide that I always try to include in talks around wildfires, in that fire is truly an interdisciplinary issue. So we can think about fire as a fundamental part of the Earth system. It's been around for about 400 million years or so, and strongly links different parts of the Earth system together. So I'm sure you all remember from high school science, the fire triangle, linking together oxygen, heat and fuel. So if I just get my pointer out, we all remember this triangle, these fire fundamentals from our high school science. And we can kind of extend this both in time and space. So being a good geographer, it's all about scale. So we can see how that triangle from fire fundamentals evolves into kind of looking at fire in the environment. So looking at how weather, topography and fuel interact. And we kind of raise that to another level, thinking around fire regimes, so looking over longer timescales and perhaps at the regional scale, in which case we're thinking about landforms, climate and vegetation. So we'll revisit fire regime later in the presentation, but I do think this is a really neat way of thinking about fire within the Earth system. But that is very much focused on the physical science and the physical environment. But where do people fit into all of this? Well, we've got to also say that fire is part of a coupled socio-ecological system. It's very hard to disconnect the two. So people influence fires through how they manage the fuel, through ignitions and so on. In bigger picture, thinking about our contribution to climate change and how that might influence things like fire weather. But we are also influenced by fire. So the impact borne by society and individuals when severe wildfires occur. So we can see in this diagram by Tiedemann and others some of the ways in which people interact with fire. So again, notice the importance of considering scale and connectivity there. Okay, in this next slide, I just kind of, again, part of setting the scene perhaps is to come up with, to think about some of those key terms that often crop up when we're discussing fire effects. I kind of want to just introduce the audience and the viewers on the video later on some of those terms I think are quite helpful. And in this case, I want to highlight a key paper by John Keeley back in 2009 in the International Journal of Wildfire, which I think is probably one of the most heavily cited vegetation fire papers of all time. I think its title gives an indication why. The title is Fire Intensity, Fire Severity and Burn Severity, a brief review and suggested usage. I think it's one of the most kind of does what it says on the tin type paper titles. So in this paper, Keeley identifies and outlines some of the use and perhaps misuse of some of these terms. So I'm not going to go into detail, but maybe we can just look at some of these overarching terms and their usage. So fire intensity, Keeley defines this kind of energy output from a fire. So thinking about the energy release from the combustion of organic matter, different ways of measuring it. So for example, you might measure it in kind of fire line intensity, so kilowatts per meter or per squared area, or some other measure of the energy output. We can then think about kind of the severity of the fire, and ultimately this is about kind of the consumption of organic matter. This might be the above ground or the below ground organic matter. Sometimes this might be divided up into vegetation's burn severity or soil burn severity. So again, some of these terms are used interchangeably, and if you want to look at more of the discussion around this, I strongly encourage you to seek out the Keeley paper. And finally, and perhaps relevant to some of our discussions today, is that ecosystem response of the long-term recovery following a fire. So what the ecosystem does or doesn't do following a fire. So we can think about that in the context of vegetation, biodiversity, but also other responses such as soil erosion and what happens to the biogeochemistry. So we've got to think about how all of these things interact, and it's not a simple relationship between, say, a really intense fire and a much more devastating long-term response. So it's not a simple relationship, it's quite a complicated thing. So for example, a low-intensity, infrequent fire in, say, the tropical rainforest, where fires are not part of the regular occurrence, may actually be quite highly damaging in the long term, as the vegetation is not adapted to that. Whereas some vegetation copes quite well with high frequency, high intensity fires and rapidly then recovers. So just kind of hopefully that helpfully sets the scene for some of our discussion later on. Okay, so I think one of the ways in which we can think about fires, both in terms of research perspective, but also the wider thing is we've got to think about the fire regime. So what are those characteristics of an area's fire history? So thinking back to that triangle diagram a few slides ago. So if you want to understand the short and the long-term response from a fire, you've got to situate them in the context of the fire regime, i.e. those characteristics of an area's fire history. So does an area have frequent but low severity fires with that rapid recovery, or those infrequent stand replacing fires, such as those fires we often see in places like North America? So in essence, it's the what, the where, and the when of fire. So what's burning, where is it burning, the spatial location and its extent, and when is it burning? So that's both in terms of the fire season, so whereabouts in the year is it occurring, frequency, the number of fires in an area per year, and the return period. So on the diagram on the right-hand side, we've got a map of historical fire regimes in the contiguous USA. And again, the colours themselves and the legend doesn't really matter too much. But for example, if we look at what's in the light blue-green number 1, get the pointer. There's a pointer, there we go, in this kind of light blue-green. We can see that large swathes of the eastern states are in this. And this is frequent but low severity fires, whereas the deep reds we perhaps see in other parts of the contiguous states are fires which may be occurring every couple of hundred years or so, but when they do occur, these are stand replacing severe fires. So again, it's all about situating the fires in that longer term context. And importantly, when we're thinking about fire regimes and the impact of any one fire, we also need to think about how this is going to change in response to things like climate change and land management activities, and how these might change in the future. Okay, so this is another way of thinking about it, and this is a great conceptual diagram, I think, from Matt Davis in his book chapter in 2013, which neatly illustrates the linkages between the different control factors, so those factors in the Earth system driving things like fire weather, influencing fuel structure, and also perhaps having an influence on ignition frequency, which determines the fire regime, so the when, the where, the what, and how the fire occurs, all of which then influence the ecosystem through the fire itself, but also these kind of longer term, bigger picture biotic and abiotic controls. So we've got to think about all of these things when we look at any one individual fire. So I want to kind of give an example of where changing fire regimes is really important. I'm not going to pick one from the UK. I'm going to pick one from the USA here, because I think this just kind of really neatly illustrates the point before we then zoom in perhaps to the UK. So this is an example again from the US. In this case, the eastern states. Perhaps we often focus on California and Oregon and the western seaboard, but we do have severe fires and significant fires throughout the US and other parts of North America. So this is a paper by Nowicki and Abrams from 2008, and in it they examined the changing fire regimes and the ecological response following fire suppression activities and fire suppression policies in the USA. So here we have two maps. We've got the past fire regime and at the time the current fire regime. So in the kind of the late 20th century, early 21st century, I think it was. And we can see in this diagram on the bottom left, we've got kind of fire severity, so the removal and the consumption of organic matter. And in this case, we're thinking particularly around the forest and the loss of the combustion of the timber and the fuel itself on one axis, and on the y-axis we're thinking about fire frequency. So we've got these group 1, so remember those frequent but perhaps low severity fires, through to rarer events that are perhaps more damaging in terms of the organic matter loss. And we can see that historical fire regimes in these states were quite varied, so we had a range of these different colours, so again 1 through to 5. But as time changed and as fire suppression policies in the USA were about extinguishing fires at kind of all costs, we see a shift to kind of fire regimes which are much more aligned to, or less aligned to, frequent fires, to more infrequent fires, but when they do occur, they're perhaps more damaging in terms of the organic matter consumption. So they kind of charted this decrease, and again we can see this dramatic change in the area burnt in these states in a 60-year period from the 1930s to the 1990s. And again, you can look at the detail in this, but there's a demonstrable change in the fire regime during that period. So why is that then important when we're thinking about the ecology? Well, what they were able to show is a process they termed mesification, whereby kind of the shift in the fire regimes, I'll just take my little laser pointer off, the changes in those fire regimes mean that the open lands brought about by a kind of a mosaic of fire activity changed to much more closed canopy forests, where fire had been excluded. Trees were able to, and forests were able to kind of re-establish and establish their dominance over the shrubs and the other species at the ground level, meaning that those heliophytes, those fire-tolerant plants, were then successfully replaced by shade-tolerant, more fire-sensitive plants in that long term. And over that period, again, they noted species level richness declining. So over that period of fire suppression, changes in the fire regime, we see a demonstrable change in the ecology in these regions as well. So I kind of want to highlight this example to understand, to try and to illustrate that understanding the interplay between fire regimes, land management, ecosystem, and ecological response is a complex picture. We've got to take everything together and try not to look at things in isolation. Okay, so we'll move on now. Now I've kind of hopefully set some of the big picture, just to think about the UK in some context. So how was our fire activity in the UK? What does it look like at the moment? We can start thinking about questions about how it's changed historically and how it might look under future pressures as well. So we're going to be looking at some examples. But before we do that, I want to note, again, as you can kind of imagine, it's a complicated picture. We have episodic wildfires in the UK, and we'll look at that in more detail in later slides. But we also have land management burns in parts of the country. We have a mosaic of different land covers and land uses, and we have pressure from people, both in terms of proximity to these habitats, but also people going out into the landscape, being kind of recreationally, going out into our rural locations, for example, but also the relationship between people, land management, ignitions, and so on. Okay. So let's look at some wildfire patterns, some data from recent fires in the UK over the next couple of slides. So I will note, though, that some of these data and reports over the next few slides will come from different geographic administrations. Some will come from England, some will come from UK, some will come from region specific, but I'll try and make it as clear as I can as we go through. But you can imagine, if I'm talking about England, similar kind of things may be occurring in the other devolved administrations as well. Okay, so when we're looking at fire statistics, we can look at a range of different databases, but one we can look at is those wildfires that are recorded by the fire and rescue services when they attend outdoor vegetation fires. And these are recorded on the Fire and Rescue Services incident recording system. Now, there are many caveats as to how these are recorded and data quality and all these kind of things, but this is one point in which we can start the discussion around fire statistics. So back in 2019, the Forestry Commission did an analysis of an 8-year period. So these are financial years because the way things are reported. But between 2009-10 and 2016-17, bit of a clunky way of saying that, in England we had over 250,000 fire incidents. That's around about 32,000 per year. And there may be some of you thinking, well, actually, that seems like a really large number. I didn't imagine we had that much of a wildfire problem. Well, most of these are small fires. So you can imagine those kind of fires that are on the edge of housing estates where they kind of abut heathlands, for example, or the edge of playing fields. So some of these are very small. So most of our fires are less than a hectare. Okay, but we do get large landscape scale fires. So if you think back over recent years across the UK, we've had events like the Saddleworth Moor and the Winter Hill fires of 2018, nearby to where I am today in Manchester. We've got the Flow Country fire up in the northern part of Scotland, in the kind of near Forsenard and Caithness back in 2019. We had Wareham Forest in 2020, and the Mourne Mountains in Northern Ireland were alight again this year. So we do get large landscape scale fires, and that's perhaps where we see a lot of the media attention. That's just from the last few years. I'm sure you know examples from where nearby to where you are, such as the 2011 fire season, going back to 2003 near me in the Peak District. If you're in the North York Moors, some people might remember the 1976 fires related to the drought that year. So wherever you are, there's probably a history and a memory of large fires here in the UK. So that's the size and kind of where they are, but where are they occurring when it comes to habitats and land cover classes? So as I said, many of these incidents are kind of in built-up areas on that kind of rural-urban interface, and indeed in gardens as well. But when we think about primary fires, and we're defining primary fires as potentially more serious fires that could harm people, or do harm people, or cause damage to property, and meet at least one of the following conditions, in that it involves fatalities, casualties, or rescues, or any fire attended by 5 or more pumping appliances. So when we're thinking about these kind of severe or potentially very serious fires, many of these are occurring in woodland and arable. So that's in terms of the number of fires. But we also need to flip it and think about the area burnt as well. So when we think about the area burnt, the majority were in arable, improved or semi-natural grassland, and the mountain, moor and heath land cover classification. So we're thinking about open habitats here as opposed to woodland. So you can go and have a look at the Forestry Commission report. It's available on the internet, and I've got a reference list at the end of the presentation for those who want to follow this up. But I do encourage you to go and have a look at this in a lot more detail and how it's all broken down for England. And we can also perhaps pick it apart when it comes to designated sites as well. So in that reporting period of 2009-10 to 2016-17, we had wildfires occurring on designated sites in every year of that reporting period. So SSIs, SPAs, and so on. So that's kind of the land cover classes and the types of habitats that the fires are occurring in. When are they occurring within our fire regime when it comes to wildfires? Well, we often maybe typically see kind of seasonal cycles in this. So we certainly see kind of a peak in fire activity in kind of the April-May period, so particularly around the spring bank holidays, but also later in the summer as well. So it's a combination of climate. We've got a combination of climate, vegetation, and human activity. So those earlier fires are often after the winter when the vegetation is cured and kind of dried out before the spring green up. And those later fires may be related to kind of the warmer temperatures. And again, you layer on top of that human activities. We certainly see kind of increases in fire activity, or can see increase in fire activity related to things like bank holidays and school holidays. So, for example, in this example from the Peak District, looking at some fire records from the National Park Rangers going back to the 1970s, we see that kind of peak in fire activity in the spring and then in the late summer. We see peaks in activity in terms of wildfire activity around weekends, bank holidays, and so on. That's just for the Peak District, but again, different areas may also be able to pull out data in a similar way. In terms of spatial patterns, we also need to think about relationship to kind of infrastructure and people. So towns, footpaths, car parks have often been noticed to have a greater ignition pattern or greater chance of ignitions than other areas. So again, similar work, in that paper from the Peak District, you can explore those in more detail. And then in the bottom picture we've got here, this is a recent paper from Julie McMorrow and colleagues doing some wildfire threat analysis on the Swinley forest fire of 2011. And again, the detail I'm not going to go into here, but this is a risk of ignition map. So it's not necessarily a map of where the ignitions were, but a risk of ignition map. And you'll notice that the higher risk of ignition in the kind of the brighter white colours are related to a very much close to the rural interface. This is close to a settlement and an urban conurbation. So lots of things to factor in, but we can break it down spatially and temporally as well. So that's part of the fire regime when we're thinking about episodic fires, and that's just a brief summary. But we also need to think about management fires as well. So in many parts of the country, fire is used as a management tool for a range of different purposes. So we often see this occurring in moorlands and heathlands related to particular management activities. So grouse shooting, sheep grazing, and others as well. So again, I'm not going to go into that in any great detail here. I'm sure many of the people on the call are kind of across that literature, but there are many kind of recent review papers that I encourage people to look at if they want to follow this up in more detail. Okay, so I'm just looking at time. I'm kind of trying to spin through this as quick as I can, but I'm happy to pick up questions later on as well. So one thing I just want to do before I go into some questions about how research can connect together, which is to highlight a particularly severe season. This was the spring fires of 2011. I'm sure many of you remember this. This was a period in which we had major fires in all parts of the UK. And here we have just some graphics illustrating that point. So we've got the BBC infographic, we've got the MODIS hotspots, and you can pick out some of those smoke plumes. So we can particularly see the one in coming from Northern Ireland, and indeed the Highlands of Scotland. And again, some great work by Mark de Jong and others looking at the fire severity index for that period as well. And these were truly exceptional conditions. So these are the temperature anomalies for spring 2011, all above average in terms of the temperature, but also the rainfall, below average in that instance. But when we look at April itself, you can see just how dry and how hot it was and what led to those fire events. And I think this is one of the most, I really love this image, this kind of little helicopter trying to, it feels like it's a little helicopter trying to fight back the fires with their little Bambi bucket of water underneath. So one of those major fire events that really kind of triggered interest was the Swinley forest fire in 2011 across the bank holiday weekend. It's one of the largest fire incidents led by the Royal Berkshire Fire and Rescue Service and the Forestry Commission. So again, you can see some of the fire behaviour and some of the fire activity. This was the crown fires in the Swinley area. So this is Crowthorne Wood. Okay. And it was a major fire, and not only from the impact on ecosystems, but the potential for damage elsewhere. So you can see on this slide from Tom Smith the damage that was done to the blocks of Forestry Commission planting. But if I want to highlight one thing, it's the infrastructure that was around it that was potentially at risk as well. So we've got the Transport Research Laboratory, we've got Crowthorne Village, we've also got Broadmoor High Security Hospital here as well. So again, thinking back to this thing about socio-ecological systems, we've got to think about the people as well. Okay, so where do we get to now in terms of UK wildfire research? So I think we're in a very good position where we, compared to where we were 10 years ago, we've got more research groups, more researchers working on UK wildfires, very much a growing interest as we are. The other thing is that we've got much more joined up thinking. And I think one thing I'd like to highlight as part of this presentation is the Knowledge for Wildfire project that ran from 2012 to 2017, and which was led by Julie McMorrow from the University of Manchester. And Julie's Knowledge Exchange Fellowship built on the momentum of the fire seminars and work with wildfire forums to really join up different sectors. And part of that was joining up researchers, but joining researchers to practitioners, government departments, and so on. And as part of this, there was a Who Does What database developed. So although this hasn't been updated since 2015, it is a good starting point, and hopefully over the next year or so, we aim to refresh that database. So keep an eye on things as that progresses. So when I say the research landscape, I'm really very careful about what I say there. It's not academics and university. It's a combined effort. So not just universities and research institutes, it's the forums, it's the England and Wales Wildfire Forum and the Scottish Wildfire Forum and the operations groups, it's government agencies, and these are just some examples, landowners, land management sector, all working together to better understand wildfires and to work together from both a research and a practice and policy perspective. So I'm going to take a note and maybe take a bit of a liberty just to plug a newish research project. And this is a consortium that started at the beginning of the pandemic, so we were a bit scuppered last year. But this is all about understanding our fuels, fire behaviour and impacts here in the UK. And it's building the building blocks for, hopefully, to develop a new fire danger rating system for the UK. So you can see all the different partners. And this was funded by NERC, the Natural Environment Research Council. And it was built to basically establish and test the scientific underpinning and key components required to build an effective, tailored UK fire danger rating system. So if you want to find out more, visit the website, follow us on social media. If you've got any questions, do ask any questions. We also have colleagues in Scotland who've been working on a project looking at Scottish fuels. So again, I'd encourage you to go and visit their website to find out more. So I'm zipping through because I want to get to long-term experiments. And this is partly what we're here to talk about today. So I wanted to, before we looked at the UK and perhaps start posing some questions for discussion, was to look at long-term experiments around the world and where wildfire comes into things. So we're looking particularly at some of those long-term ecological research networks in, say, America and North America. I'm sure many of you know these sites. But a lot of these areas have really kind of a strong history of understanding disturbance regime, be they forestry operations such as logging, storm damage, insects and disease, and so on. And for many of these sites, wildfire forms a really important backdrop to understanding the sites, either as part of the long-term history for the site, or indeed as an active part of the site activity. So I picked a couple of examples. One is Bonanza Creek in Alaska, looking at that kind of forest recovery following a wildfire, as well as how insects and disease interact and intersect with fire. And another one I wanted to highlight was the H.J. Andrews experimental forest, and this is a site, some of you may know it, where understanding the current regime shifts is really important to understand the historical fire regime. So there's lots of kind of work on reconstructing the long-term history through dendrochronology as well. But I highlight this because the site was affected by a major fire, the Holiday Farm fire in 2020, back in September 2020. So these sites are not invulnerable to fires. So this fire actually ended up damaging a number of the long-term monitoring plots, some that have been actually monitored for 50 years or so. But as true kind of researchers and scientists, the team there started developing plans to see how they could monitor that fire and how they could use that decades of pre-fire monitoring to better understand the changes following that fire, the Holiday Farm fire. So I just wanted to highlight that in other parts of the world, fire is very much a part of long-term experiments, particularly when it comes to wildfires. So where are we in terms of LTEs and fire? So I kind of, as part of my prep for today's session, I had a bit of a poke around and found the 2015 report, the National England Commission report, looking at these long-term experiments. And there were just 10 instances of the word fire in this report, in reference to the Hard Hill burning experiment in the North Pennines, and I'll come back to that. Cullodock in Scotland, which is a fire end deposition and grazing experiment, which is kind of a fully factorial design, and the Rwarben project site in northeast Wales. So I'm sure many people on this call can know these sites much more than I do, but I think it was interesting that many of these experimental sites kind of also look at the interaction with other disturbances and indeed other pressures as well. So keep that in mind as well. So that was 2015. So again, where are we today? I've just picked out a couple of examples as to where we find ourselves now. So Morehouse, particularly the Hard Hill plots in the North Pennines, many of us are familiar with that site. And I have to say I'm a bit biased here. That's where I did my PhD studies. So I've got a bit of a soft spot for the site and the drive up from Garrigill, or perhaps maybe not so in the winter months. And we know that we've got lots of extensive reporting from various fields from those plots. We've got the Peatland ES UK sites, which were established back in 2011 across Yorkshire and Lancashire, looking at moorland management, so burning part of it, but also looking at cutting and mowing. And it's really great to see the 10th year of vegetation surveys. And I think Andreas is in the call. So well done to Andreas and his team for getting to the 10th year. It feels like a very milestone moment there. Now, both of those previous examples were looking principally at management fires, and as my talk is about wildfires, I just want to give you an example of that, where we might think about this and how we might take things forward. So we've got the Thursley Common sites down in Surrey, which is principally an end deposition experiment, but we do have wildfires on the site from 2006 and the 2020 events. So I don't know if Jill's on Jill Cowell from Kew is on the call, but I know that some of the work at the moment is looking about the recovery of bryophytes in a neighbouring wildfire affected areas just outside of the LTEs, but is now going to be incorporated within some of that monitoring. So go and have a look at the write-up in the Impressel et al. In their article in Field Biology. Field Bryology. Put my teeth back in there. Okay, and these are the last couple of slides really to kind of just maybe pose a few questions. And I think this is a really interesting point at which we can take some discussion. And this stems from the Natural England Evidence Review back in 2020, which is the causes and prevention of wildfires on heathlands and peatlands in England. So again, an England focus here, but again, we can ask similar questions in different parts of the UK as well. And in it, they highlighted a series of 8 questions around ignition sources, factors affecting fire behaviour, and so on. But I think for now, I just wanted to pick out 2 of these key research areas, one of which was around vegetation, habitat and fire regime, and one was the relationship between managed burning and wildfire. So again, I'm not going to go into these in any great detail, but there's lots of things lots of detail within that Natural England report. So again, I'd encourage you to go and have a look at that. So perhaps under the vegetation, habitat and fire regime research area, do we really understand that relationship between sward composition and structure on the occurrence, severity and extent of wildfire? What role does habitat restoration play on wildfires themselves? So again, thinking about the pre-fire, the fire itself, and the long-term response. And then also thinking about that natural or historic fire regime in the UK. So do we really know what our historic fire regime is for different parts of the country, and how that then relates to how vegetation communities have adapted? And then finally, that relationship between managed burning and wildfire. Again, we can broaden that out even further. So other management activities. How does grazing affect wildfire occurrence? How does bracken management affect fires in those areas? So I've really flashed through those, but I'm just posing questions for a bit of discussion. So in the context of that Natural England review, I've just picked out a couple of my kind of personal thoughts here. So when a wildfire occurs and there's an opportunity to monitor the site, what are those key parameters we need to measure in the short term that will be useful to understand the long-term response? So if we're going to set up a long-term monitoring on a recent wildfire, what do we need to capture in that immediate post-fire period that's going to be helpful to understand that long-term response? How do we ensure these this long-term monitoring after major wildfires? What are those opportunities and challenges in setting up monitoring of wildfire sites? And maybe perhaps a bit provocative at the very end, is there a role for doing large-scale experimental burnings so fires by their nature we have to often study post hoc and after the fact. So could we conduct some large-scale experimental fires at a scale that is appropriate and a kind of approaching wildfire conditions? So provocative questions, but hopefully stimulation for our discussion. So just to conclude, is just to kind of recap really, is that fire really is a dynamic hazard. It's spatially and temporally complex. We've got a fire regime in the UK that's a combination of both management fires and wildfires, and the interaction between those two is really important to understand. But also those pressures that we are placing on these in terms of in the context of climate change, land use change, human pressures, and so on. So how are things going to pan out over the next 10, 20, 50 years, for example? So think about this in the context of net zero agenda, the 25-year environment plan. Do we really know enough about the fire ecosystem responses in UK systems? And there's lots of great ongoing research in the UK and globally to better understand fire behaviour and ecosystem impacts. And maybe there are some opportunities to link that long-term monitoring and to develop those shared protocols. So again, if people are at a site immediately after a fire, what could they capture that might be useful to understand that longer term response? Okay, so that's the end of my presentation. I think I may have overrun. Sorry if I've done that, but if there are any questions, feel free to pop them in the chat. I see a few things pinging up in the chat as we went along. But there is a quick reference list. I'll put it up on the screen there. So if people want to take a screen grab, or if you're watching the recording later on, feel free to pause at this point. And that's just some examples, some references that may be helpful to get into some of the UK wildfire research. So I'll just flick back to my previous slide if I can, and leave it there for any questions.